All right, guys. So today we have Dr. Tyler Rowe, legend, ICEM instructor, clinician for not just a little bit of time, but you're coming on to your 25th year of practice, Tyler. Is that right?
Certainly am.
That's amazing. That's really good for like clinicians in Australia. So very, very impressive. And so you're lecturing with you've been lecturing around the world in the last couple of years before COVID hit, but you were you were on a whirlwind tour of bringing the gospel of Chinese medicine to the world. What were you speaking about primarily?
So I was in, year before last now, I was in Germany. Oh, sorry, it's still last year. Yeah, I'm losing track. I was in Germany last year speaking on the Wu Yun Liu-Qi system, the 5 movements and 6 Qi, which is sort of the medical meteorological system from the Neijing, chapters 66 to 71 and 74, and teaching that as part of the ICAM group, and we were going to be teaching it in New Orleans this year, but unfortunately it didn't happen in April this year. So tragically the course on seasonal illnesses and with a focus on epidemics was ironically held up by an epidemic, which was kind of funny, but seemed appropriate.
Predicted, I imagine, like as part of your prediction, I imagine.
Oh yeah, I absolutely predicted it. Yeah, I called it. Yeah.
And so today, you've got some ideas about what you wanted to speak about. We have people coming on just chatting about formulas that strike them as something interesting. And what's the formula you wanted to speak about today?
Zhen Wu Tang.
Zhen Wu Tang. All right, let's go. I mean, this formula is not, before ICEM, I hadn't really considered that formula too much, but it's certainly dominates the clinical practice around the world now. And tell us a little bit about it.
Well, the reason I wanted to talk about Zhen Wu Tang is 2 reasons. It's got, I think, one of the most epic origin backstories of any formula. It's like a superhero of formulas. And I love a good backstory. I think a good backstory can give us really good context. The same when we have a good backstory on a practitioner. It's really lovely when you hear somebody's journey as to how they got to where they are. It gives you context, helps you appreciate where they're coming from. It engenders trust. I have a miserable backstory in Chinese medicine. I watched too many Bruce Lee movies, wanted to be a kung fu master, wasn't any good, did Chinese medicine, not a great backstory. And it's a pet hate of mine when people spend a whole lot of time doing their big intro of their amazing backstory if their backstory is a bit crap. But there are some people have amazing stories, and if anyone hasn't had a listen to Simon's backstory, he's got a great journey as to how he got to where he is in Chinese medicine. And I've always loved that. And that was something that really attracted me early on to studying with Arnaud Versluis. And also I do some study on the acupuncture side of things with David White. And they've got amazing stories how they got there. And when I see that in a herbal formula, it really excites me. I love a lot of the symbols and the philosophy that goes into Chinese medicine. If it's got a practical application, I'm all about, I always say my principle I work by is Gong Fu, hard work, applied skill. Theory, application, T-Yong, body and principle and use. So I love to see that rich backstory. I love to understand where a formula came from. Zhen Wu Tang's got this amazing origin story. And also it's one of our most common formulas we use within the ICAM system. Very practical formula, particularly this year according to the Yunqi system. So it was just a no-brainer for me to talk about Zhen Wu Tang. And I really appreciate, Simon, that you let me choose Zhen Wu Tang early on, because I know it's probably a popular formula that a few people were considering speaking about. Maybe it's a bit of an easy choice, but I just think it's got a really interesting story. So yeah,
some of the simplest formulas have got the most application, but sometimes they just don't. Sometimes they just get overlooked, which really happens so often. Li Zhong one, for example. All these formulas, they just get overlooked. Oh, that's too simple. Gun Xiao Tang, for crying out loud. I mean, look at that. Yes. That is incredible formula. It's like, whatever. I'm going to modify with Gun Xiao Tang. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I cut my teeth like a lot of other practitioners on the university system. And I learned with practitioners who said minimum 13 herbs. Every formula, 13 herbs. Everything had to be modified. No traditional formula could possibly exist without massive modification. And a lot of the time it was building a formula from scratch, which was a pet hate of mine. And I think I was lucky in the sense that back when I studied, it was two separate degrees. So I did an acupuncture degree, and then they introduced a herbal medicine degree in my final few years. So I was already out in practice. And I was in practice prescribing pills, which was awful, just prescribing like the cheap pills, like just, throwing out handfuls of them that did nothing, they were rubbish. But I learned formulas really well. So when we came to studying formulas at uni, I said, yeah, I know that formula. Oh, I know that formula. And we'd sit in clinic and I'd watch somebody build this formula from scratch and say this, this, this. And I go, that's long done Shegan Tang. Oh, is it now? And I thought, there's got to be, and I looked at the courses in China and there's a huge emphasis on formulas. So I learnt my formulas well. And because I was trying to learn formulas by myself initially, it was a lot easier to learn the small formulas. So I looked at a lot of these smaller formulas early on and went, they're great. I like those. I don't know if I'll ever be able to use unmodified, because you can't use unmodified formulas. And the great thing is nowadays, half the time I prescribe Zhen Wu Tang, it's totally unmodified. It's just a straight out Zhen Wu Tang. I love prescribing formulas unmodified. I guess I have the advantage I treat a lot of local people in my area, and I'm able to see people come back in 2 days, 5 days, a week. And I don't charge a lot of money, so it's easy for people to come back. So I love being able to say, look, there's this and this going on, but let's just go with this. Let's just see what Zhen Wu Tang does. It gives you a really good appreciation of it. And when I modify little bits here and there. I don't like to stack too many formulas together.
Mm. And you were talking about just early, before we started recording, you were talking about yourself, the current situation that you are in Melbourne during COVID, and talking about how, those return patients, those return care patients, you don't see, your primary care for a lot of people. And that's really, that's a whole different way of practicing Chinese medicine as a primary care, as opposed to the maintenance treatments and beauty treatments and these sort of things. Do you think that that's where you learn? Where do you learn the most, do you feel?
Well, look, I think, like a lot of other people, I started off doing a lot more maintenance stuff, and I'd sort of had this idea drummed into me. I mean, I learnt from a bunch of old hippies who were lovely people who'd been academics for years, who were all about one day you've got to learn how to treat with one acupuncture needle, or the ultimate level of treatment is no treatment or preventative treatment. And I was like, yeah. And we had these these very these very idealistic goals that one day we're going to be superior physicians. And in reality, we're shit and piss practitioners. We're nuts and bolts. And I spent years trying to sort of aspire to something that wasn't practical, trying to do all these preventative treatments when people didn't want to come in when they weren't well. And so what I was doing was kind of a lesser version of Chinese medicine. It kind of spa culture stuff, just doing well-being and stuff. And it was mostly through a few practitioners I was lucky enough to spend time with, in particular studying with the ICAM, that really directed me towards, we're dealing with some pretty serious stuff here. Like, this is, when we're dealing with Han Dynasty medicine, it's not spa culture. This is life and death stuff. And this is what I really enjoy. And that's when, for years, I'd sort of thought, what's my speciality going to be? Everyone talks about specialities nowadays. And one of my teachers turned around one day and said, you already have a speciality. It's Zha Bing. I was like, Zha Bing's miscellaneous. That's a crap speciality. Like, no, that's complex diseases. That's all the other stuff. And I'm like, that's it. And that's what I wanted to focus on, was diagnostics and treating serious conditions. I thought for years Chinese medicine was rubbish at weight loss, stop smoking and all these sort of things. It probably isn't. I'm rubbish at those things. And it was one of my teachers years ago, he said, you know why? And I said, no. He said, because you don't care. And he's right. I absolutely don't care about weight loss. I absolutely don't care about stop smoking. It sounds terrible, I don't care that much about fertility. It doesn't excite me that much. I care about making a big change. And I don't do it for some idealistic, noble reasons of like healing the world. I do it because I want to get better at the medicine. And the best way for me to get better at the medicine is to see people and see serious conditions. And that's why something like Zhen Wu Tang, I mean, it's a Shanghan formula. It's not just, it can be used long term. but it's not just some wishy-washy sort of, vague tonic formula that you can just take in a pill form forever. Like, this is a powerful formula.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about why. Why did you choose it? I mean, it's you're choosing it because of simplicity or other reasons.
Well, mostly, as I said, to start with, it's the backstory. Like,
Mm.
I love a good origin story. I'm a superhero fan, and I love a good, and Zhen Wu Tang is like a superhero formula. The first time we see Zhen Wu Tang is actually in, or what is now a lost text, but we've got some sections of it kept, and that's the Tang Ye Jing, or the Yin Tang Ye Jing. Yin was like the patron saint of cooks, and the Tang Ye Jing is like the brews and decoctions classic. Now it's it's a Han Dynasty text. It's lost, but we have sections of it survived in the Fuxing Jue. The Fuxing Jue is like the secret key to medicine, which was written by Tao Hongjing. Tao Hongjing, very famous Taoist practitioner, who we thank him for actually our surviving copies of the Shannon Bunsao Jing, our original Materia Medica, only survives because of Tao Hongjing's commentary and annotations of that text. And he chose 60 formulas from the Tang Ye Jing and put them in his text called the Fuxing Jue. And the Fuxing Jue was found not so long ago in the Dunhuang caves. So we were able to recover 60 of the original 360 Tang Ye Jing formulas. And in that, there is a formula called, well, there's two formulas by the name of Zhen Wu Tang. Zhen Wu being the dark warrior, the black warrior, or the black tortoise. There's the Shao Zhen Wu Tang, and there's the Da Zhen Wu Tang. Shao Zhen Wu Tang, the small Zhen Wu formula, that is very close to what we now call Zhen Wu Tang. A very slight difference. And then there's the Da Zhen Wu Tang, which is a bigger version. Now, the whole thing that really got me interested about this, I, as a hobby for years, and I did some practice as well, I did a lot of study and played around with feng shui and also Chinese astrology. Now, I don't believe Chinese astrology should be put in medicine. It's separate. It's another Chinese art. It's interesting. It relies on a lot of the same principles. It's all yin-yang, 5 elements. It's all, it all uses the same tools, but it's not medicine. But I did learn a lot from having studied feng shui and having practiced feng shui for a few years, and having studied Chinese astrology helped me understand a lot of the more difficult parts of some of the systems I teach now. But in Chinese astronomy, not astrology, in astronomy, there's 4 major macro constellations. And the macro constellation of the north is the Zhen Wu, the dark warrior. So it's the constellation in the northern part of the sky, and it's the constellation that correlates with winter, with the north, with cold, with the trigram Kan, the water trigram. And we call these macro constellations because within each of these constellations there's 7 asterisms, or mansions people often use, lunar mansions. And asterisms like a little group of stars. And there's like 7 little groups of stars that make up the big macro constellation that's the dark warrior. And then there's also the red bird, which is the constellation of the south, the white tiger, which is the constellation of the west, and the green dragon, which is the constellation of the east. And this is something that sort of tweaked my interest straight away. When I first came across the idea that Zhen Wu Tang used to be called Zhen Wu Tang, I'm like, oh, this is like got some correlation to this constellation. And it's actually in the Tang Ye Jing, it's one of what they call the 6 spirit decoctions. And that is the 4 directions, plus there was one for the center, and there was one for with no direction. And so as one of those constellations, it was sort of one of the original key formulas for cold damage. In fact, it probably was the key cold damage formula because it was the formula of the north. And in the original Tang Ye Jing, we have a whole lot of formulas that are the 5 element base. So we have formulas for major and minor tonification of each of the elements. And then we have a section on the 6 spirit decoctions, which are all about cold damage. So the more I looked at this, I went, hang on, this is like the original cold damage formula. And it correlates to this amazing constellation. And so it created quite an interesting backstory. And then you get to Zhang Zhongjing, and you get to Han Dynasty. You get to later in the Han Dynasty when Zhang Zhongjing comes around, and he calls it Zhen Wu Tang. And I was like, well, why is it suddenly Zhen Wu Tang? That's why I missed the whole thing earlier. I was like, what's this true warrior? I mean, that sounds cool, but it's so much cooler if it was the dark warrior, like the black warrior, which is sometimes correlated to the tortoise. And I was kind of disappointed. I was like, I wish there was like a black warrior thing. And I didn't make the connection till later, or when it was taught to me that name was removed, like the Zhen Wu was removed, or the Xuan Wu was removed. That was Taoist terminology. And in the later stages of the Han Dynasty, there was the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which was a largely Taoist rebellion. And when that rebelled, they removed a lot of the Taoist terminology that was used in Chinese medicine, because it was kind of, not the sort of words you wanted to be using. And also there was an imperial edict that banned use of the character Xuan because it was one of the emperor's names. So you want to get rid of all the Taoist terminology. You can't use the character of the emperor's name anymore. So Zhang Zhongjing goes, that's cool, we'll just call it Zhen Wu, the true warrior. But it really is the same formula, Zhen Wu Tang. There's only one tiny difference, and that is when Zhang Zhongjing got the formula, he said, great, I love it. He dropped the Ganzhang out, put Shengzhang in. So just one change of Ganzhang to Shengzhang. That might have been an access issue. I mean, Shengzhang, you can only get if you grow it, kind of thing. Like historically, you can't just buy it from the supermarket. If you want fresh Shengzhang, you've got to know someone that grows it, and it does grow better in the south. And if we're looking at the formula for the north, maybe they just didn't have a lot of access to fresh Shengzhang then, so they were doing it with Ganzhang. Maybe later on when Zhang Zhongjing comes around, there's better communication and transport. I don't know, but he chose to drop the Shengzhang out, add Ganzhang in, but then he brings Ganzhang back in later as a modifier to Zhen Wu Tang. So there's a little bit of the backstory on Zhen Wu Tang.
That's a hell of a backstory, man. A hell of a backstory.
And so Xiao Xuan Wu Tang became our Zhen Wu Tang, Da Xuan Wu Tang, the bigger formula. And in the Tang Ye Jing, they have like the smaller formula is sort of like the base formula. And this is in the Tang Ye Jing, it talks about the Xuan Wu Tang as the formula for to treat heavenly movements, celestial movements, so exterior, like cold damage. And it's a formula for insufficiency of the kidney with deficient interior cold. And it lists a few symptoms. It lists, which are very similar to the Zhen Wu Tang symptoms in line 316. It lists inhibited urination. It lists, it actually lists cold of the four extremities, which in Zhen Wu Tang later becomes heaviness and pain of the four extremities. But similar, it lists abdominal pain. It doesn't mention diarrhea, which is interesting because it was actually contained Ganzhang originally. Diarrhea is added as a perhaps symptom on the end of line 316. So in this original format, that was like the smaller formula, and then you have the bigger formula, which is going to be the same base, but with some additional herbs for additional pathology. And basically the bigger formula, when you get to Da Xuan Wu Tang, was Zhen Wu Tang or Xuan Wu Tang with additional herbs to deal with Tai Yin dampness symptoms. So it's kind of like adding Li Zhongwan into Zhen Wu Tang. That doesn't appear later on in Zhang Zhongjing's writings. You can sort of get there by modifying other formulas, but he didn't directly put that into his text. He kind of sat with the Xiao Xuan Wu Tang. And as I said, he kept, when you look at line 316, he kept the same symptomology, abdominal pain, inhibited urination, except he talks about heaviness and pain of the extremities instead of cold of the extremities. And he also talks about spontaneous diarrhea, but it's very similar. Like the language is almost exactly the same. The formula is almost exactly the same. So we're sure that's where it came from. It's just Zhang Zhongjing decided to sort of play with it a little bit.
So you've got your pulse diagnostics to prescribe the formula. It does become very difficult. I think people have different ways of applying formulas these days because there's so much foundational training. And so to the people who don't have that pulse, that's calibration, what can you recommend to them? Like, how do you use this?
The pulse is really important, and Zhen Wu Tang's one where, sorry.
For those people, how do you use it in clinic?
Yeah. I mean, look, pulse is really important, and Simon and I are lucky enough to have studied a really extensive pulse system. And with that, I'm not just going to stand here and just reel off all the possibilities for the pulse for Zhen Wu Tang. We don't need to, because unless you've studied a pulse system, calibrated and understood how that pulse system works, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But we can kind of build the pulse for Zhen Wu Tang out of the text. There isn't a direct line that says Zhen Wu Tang, the pulse is this, but there are a few other lines we can sort of work out and build the pulse. And so we can build a basic pulse for it. And then what we want on top of that is really the key symptoms. Because one thing I think with a formula lecture, and this is something that came up recently, I was listening to another podcast, totally different podcast, not this one, and they were just talking about, they said, oh, we're going to talk all about one formula for half an hour. I was like, wow, half an hour on a formula? I mean, I could do a whole day on Zhen Wu Tang and still have more material. And for half an hour, they just listed conditions that are treated. And out of context, it actually made that formula, I think, for people who are being introduced to it, more confused. Because now it looked like it treated everything. And they actually went from top to bottom. So they went through all the head stuff it treated, all the chest stuff it treated, all the abdominal stuff it treated, all the leg stuff, all the knee stuff, through the entire body. Okay, it was a tonic formula. I can't even remember which tonic it was. I've kind of forgotten a lot of my old TCM formulas. But they went through the entire body, and what you were left with was a massive list of conditions, but no better idea of how to prescribe it. So I think key symptoms are really important. Understanding that key symptomology and understanding the pulse.
It's totally right. I mean, you can take any case whatsoever, and you can take it subjectively, objectively. You know, you can guide people into a thing if you were, if you so wished to. Obviously, you wouldn't do that, but I mean, there is possibility out there to do that. If all you've got is Zhen Wu Tang in the car, you can start talking about these symptoms, and then people can come up and present with them. Yeah, actually, now that you mention it, last week, you can find those ways. This is not medicine. This is not the art at all, by any stretch of the imagination. So,
and look, I'd love to think that I hope one day to be at the point where the grandfather of our system, Dr. Tien, would take the pulse, no questions, just please be quiet. And look, I dream of the day one day when clients come in home to say, shut up, give me a pulse, don't even speak. But I'm still at the point where I take the pulse, I get an idea, then I've got to ask a few questions, and I don't want to waste a whole lot of time. I think, like a lot of people, I started off at uni asking I think it was like the 8 basic questions. Like it was like a Ming Dynasty concept, like the 8 questions, and I'd ask everybody about all these 8 questions, and they were coming in for something totally unrelated, and I'm going, well, how about pain? Do you have pain? How about sweating? Do you have sweating? And it's not remotely related to their condition. And I kept expanding that out till I had this massive questionnaire with a whole lot of information that didn't fine-tune what I was doing at all. In fact, off that information, I could have come up with 20 different formulas. And now I want to be at the stage,
absolutely,
where I sit down and I say, okay, I'm taking this pulse. How, and I don't mean it in a nasty way to my clients. Think how it's not how little time I can, how efficient can I be? How minimal can I be on asking questions just to go, yep, nailed it. Don't want any more information to confuse it. And even the same right down to, I loved letting go of tongue diagnosis. I very rarely look at tongue now because I went, it's another level of diagnosis. And if they don't match up, it just gets confusing. Now I'm just on pulse, and it's great. And I think it's so much easier when you've got those key symptoms. And with Zhen Wu Tang, it's line 316 in the Shanghan Lun that gives out those key symptoms. And it's the same symptoms that we're just talking about that were in Xiao Shuan Wu Tang in the Tang Ye Jing. And that is abdominal pain. Now, there's a lot of formulas that can have abdominal pain, but we see that pulse and we go abdominal pain, and it's usually around the umbilical region. If you look at Fukushima, they diagnose Zhen Wu Tang patterns around the umbilicus, so the periumbilical region. Inhibited urination, but we know it can also not have an inhibited urination because that's one of the modifications of Zhen Wu Tang. And then this. In the tongue edging, it talked about cold of the extremities. When it talks about cold of the extremities, it's not talking about like si ni, which is like reversal cold of the extremities. That's when the tips and when the hands are freezing cold. This is more talking about the whole extremities cold. I think in the language it uses si zhi leng, so si for zhi, limbs, leng, cold. So it's the 4 limbs are cold, the whole limb is cold. In the Shanghan Lun, that actually Zhang Zhongjing kind of refines that and talks about it as a heaviness and like a heaviness and pain of the extremities. But that heaviness and pain of the extremities is the same mechanism as cold throughout the whole limb, and that is yang has left the building. There's no yang left in the limbs. When there's no yang there, you get yin accumulating. When you get yin accumulating, you get water accumulating. It gets heavy, it gets dull, achy, and it gets cold as well. So the key symptoms I always want to look for with for a Zhen Wu Tang is the abdominal pain, most likely inhibited urination, and that change in the limbs, that heaviness, ache, or cold in the limbs. Usually diarrhea, but it even says further on in 316, it says there's perhaps diarrhea. And when he says perhaps, that usually means there's modification later on that can be modified in the formula. So perhaps diarrhea, there's 4 he talks about, perhaps diarrhea, perhaps there's no uninhibited, perhaps there is uninhibited urination, not inhibited urination. So usually we have inhibited urination, we might have uninhibited urination, we might have diarrhea, we might have retching, and the 4th one is we might have, I'm losing it, diarrhea. Yeah, which is actually spontaneous diarrhea in the line, but we also talk about diarrhea as a perhaps symptom. So it just means there's a modification for it. And so my key symptoms I always look for is that abdominal pain, inhibited urination, that change in the limbs, that cold, sinking heaviness, diarrhea, and then maybe I'll look for a cough or uninhibited urination, or perhaps diarrhea, or perhaps retching. And also from line 82, 81. 82, which is the earlier line of Zhen Wu Tang, there's a whole nother set of symptoms that we see there, which are very similar to the Lingui Zhugan Tang symptoms, and that is shaking and trembling, palpitations, twitching and movements in the body. So that's another set of symptoms, but it's always coming back to those primary symptoms, looking at abdominal pain, inhibited urination, heaviness or cold of the limbs, diarrhea, and then a few other modifiers that we can, maybe there's this, maybe there's that. And I think if you get a good grasp on those and combine it with a pulse, you've got a really good start to say, okay, this is potentially a Zhen Wu Tang, or a Zhen Wu Tang that I can use some slight modifications on.
And so we talked a little bit, I talked with Arno recently about, the level of modifications you can do. And, he was talking about doing, years and years on unmodified formulas, years and years on the classical modifications, and then years and years on combining formulas with those modifications. So in your practice, what do you typically adhere to? What's your philosophy on that?
Yeah, look, I remember years ago Arno saying the same thing, and we talked about this in Germany last year. I said, look, it really stuck with me when he said spend a lot of time practicing the formula unmodified first. And because I started as many years ago when I was just doing acupuncture as a pill practitioner, that's the only choice I had, was unmodified formulas. So I was quite comfortable with that idea. In fact, I was more comfortable with that than modifications. And early on in my training in ICM, I'd look at some of these combinations. I always remember one that Laurie Ayres did on our forum, just as a bit of a joke. He was combining some of the formulas with the longest names and seeing how many formulas with long names you could combine together, and sort of creating this whole imaginary pathology just to sort of see if he could combine all these formulas together. And it was fun. It was just an exercise. It was a bit of a laugh. But I looked at it and went, oh my God, that just, when I see massive formulas combined with massive formulas, just formula names, let alone the ingredients, it used to make me panic a lot. And I go, I'm still trying to handle these basic ones. And so I really stuck with that idea when Arno said, spend a few years. And in fact, we were in Germany, and I said, and I've just forgotten how many years. And Arno's in the front row in the course going, it's like 2. It's 2. And I go, it's 4, wasn't it? 4? 8 years. 8 years. 8 years on unmodified formulas.
I thought it was 3 or 5 or something.
I was like, isn't it?
The more you do it, the more years you have to spend.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure Arno was saying 2. Or maybe he was saying 4. I know, maybe it was 8. I just sort of, yeah. And so I just kept going on modified formulas. And so but when I say unmodified, I was always comfortable using an inline classical like a postscript modification. If the formula has a standard modification, I was all for that. That's great, because that's a written modification. Like, that's got just as long a history as the formula. But as for then combining other formulas or modifying in more, more eclectic ways, I really still avoid. I like to try and use base formula with classical modification, or maybe combining formulas. And it's like, I can talk about it after. There's a few modifications I do on Zhen Wu Tang They're not, and actually I don't always use the inline modifications. Like it talks about the modification for diarrhea is Bai out, Gan Zhang in. I actually usually go all the way to a Zhen Wu Tang. So I add Xin Zhang out, Gan Zhang in. I also add in the rest of the ingredients of Li Zhongwan. So I add in the Zhigan Sao and the Remshen to make up like the Li Zhongwan with Zhen Wu Tang. And that's how I deal with diarrhea. But I tend to use only very slight modifications, just a few herbs, or maybe adding in one formula. I think I've only a few times in the last few weeks had situations where I've had to actually combine 3 formulas. Now, that said, you'll often look and go, oh, within that formula, there's this formula. Within that, I've got Gunsao, so I've got Gunsao tongue in there too. I've always got Gunsao tongue in there. And you can find a lot of other formulas, but my thinking is I've got 1, maybe 2 formulas. And I think that comes back to pulse. Like for me, I was lucky to have had a good teacher, for a mentor that I'd studied with for many years, who I'd learnt really good pulse from. That was Graham Gillette. I spent years with Graham, and he was really big on pulse and diagnostics. So I'd had good calibration on pulse there, and I had a fairly competent understanding of the different qualities. I remember one day coming into him about 4 years after I'd started sort of apprenticing with him, say, "Hey, I finally got it. I've got the tight pulse." And he was like, "That's great. There's only like 24 others to catch up." Sort of thought, wow, I was devastated. He's like, no, that's really good, because most practitioners out there, they're 10 years, 20 years in, and they don't realize they still haven't even gotten a handle on the tight pulse. So I was really focused on trying to find out basic pulse qualities. And so for me, when I looked and went, right, well, if I've got one formula, there's one pulse I'm looking for. As soon as I'm combining formulas, I'm looking for more pulses. Now, obviously, when I'm feeling the pulse, I'm going to be feeling the qualities, multiple qualities in there, which will indicate multiple formulas. But if something, what I try and look for is what really stands out. Okay, that's really standing out. I can really see a Zhen Wu Tang pulse there. There might be this, and this, and that's where it starts to get a little bit more vague for me. That I'll go, right, I'm going to stick with base formula. Now, 10 years on in that system and practicing more, I can get on and go, yep, there's this, and this, but I'll still do it. I'll still take the pulse and go, ooh, that's a Zhen Wu Tang, and there's this as well. I'm going to treat one pathology at a time. As I said, that's the advantage of having a loyal client base of local clients where I can say, I don't have to give you both these formulas. I'm going to give you one formula. I'm going to treat that first, then come back and do this. So maybe Zhen Wu Tang will be the second formula that I'm heading to. I'll clear something else out. I don't have to sort of lump them all in together. And I think it was just keeping that clarity in my mind so I knew what I was treating, so I could see, okay, when I just gave Zhen Wu Tang and it worked, that was great. When it didn't work, I know one thing. I know it's not Zhen Wu Tang now. But combining formulas or massive formulas, I just got more lost. And as I said, with pulse, it was more confusing. And one of my things I did early on, I really appreciated learning a really complex pulse system. But I went back and spent time just looking at the lines that actually talk about pulse and go, okay, these are the lines we have. We've got our really complex pulse system, which is part of a lineage, which is fantastic. But I went back and went, what are the basic lines we have on pulse, and started really understanding those lines first before even getting into our pulse system. So really even taking it one step further back and really looking at building blocks. And that's why I think something like Zhen Wu Tang is great, because you can kind of build a really good pulse picture for it out of the lines in the text and get a good idea of what sort of the base pulse will be like, even without having studied a complex pulse system. Even without, looking up whatever text, you look at Bensky, it's got this pulse, and some other text has another pulse, and another text has another pulse. From the lines, you can get a really nice, clear what the original base pulse should be for a Zhen Wu Tang.
So you got to share that with us, mate. Like we're all dying here.
Absolutely.
Let us know.
Well, first thing we look at, so line 281, which is the standard presentation line for Shaoyin disease, the Tigan line, the standard presentation line, Shaoyin disease, and it mentions 2 symptoms: somnolence. 281. Yeah, 281. A desire for sleep or somnolence, and a faint and thin pulse. Okay, so desire to sleep, key symptom for all Shaoyin. So that's one of the other key symptoms I look for Zhen Wu Tang, but that can indicate any Shaoyin condition. But the pulse we start off with is faint and thin. So okay, that's our starting point for the pulse, faint and thin. Now we also know from the outline. Now the outline chapter, this is from There's 3 chapters that aren't included in most modern versions of the Shanghan Lun. There's 2 chapters on the pulse, the Pianmai-Fa and the Bing-Mai-Fa. They are around in a few editions. You can find them in Jonathan Schell's book, and there's an app that has them. I'm just messing with Simon. It's on Simon's app, so you can have a look at that. That's got the 2 pulse chapters. And there's also another chapter after that, which we refer to as the outline chapter of Shanghan Lun. That is in Jonathan Schell versions. Unfortunately, it's not in Simon's app, the outline chapter. In the outline chapter, it gives a little pulse for each of the 6 conformations. And I'm going to have to paraphrase it. I'm going to try not paraphrase. I'm going to try and remember off the top of my head. When Ch through the Sun pulses, or when Sun through the Ch pulses, when all pulse positions are deep and thin, the illness must be in Shaoyin, for it has lasted 5 or 6 days. Okay, so we already had faint and thin from line 281. That's a standard Shaoyin pulse. Now we look at the standard Shaoyin pulse in the outline. It says deep and thin. So we've got 3 elements now. So we've got deep, faint, and thin. Now that's a good basis for a Zhen Wu Tang pulse. You can just go with that, deep, faint, and thin. You don't have to much further. You get to line 283, and it talks about when yin and yang pulses are both tight, it means the demise of yang. Now, in that line, it's probably talking more about a Suni Tang. It doesn't name a formula. It's talking more about Suni Tang, but it talks about a tight pulse. And we know it's fundamental in our Chinese medicine. It's in Ling Shu chapter 4. It's in the Pianmai chapter we were just talking about before, that a tight pulse indicates cold. And in fact, in the Pianmai-Fa, it has a really lovely description of the Wari pulse and the tight pulse. And that is, it describes a Wari pulse, because they're both yin pulses in the Pianmai-Fa, the first 2 chapters of the original Shanghan Lun. And it describes a tight pulse. A Wari pulse is like a bowstring, and that a tight pulse is like a wrung rope. So a Wari pulse is where you've stretched it out and put it under tension. And then a tight pulse is where you've twisted that. Like when you twist a rope again and again, it starts to kind of bunch up and get thicker. And that is that a Wari pulse is kind of a tight pulse that isn't yet tight. Okay, so it's also a cold pulse. We tend to a lot of the time in TCM talk about it as a liver qi stagnation pulse. It's a stagnation pulse, but it's stagnation of fluids. And when we get a lot of fluid stagnate, eventually, if there's too much fluid stagnation, there's too much yin in an area, it becomes cold. So Wari is a stagnation of fluids, and then tight is the progression from that to cold in the area. So if we go from that original line, we've got faint and thin, and then we can add in from the outline, we've also got deep, and then we can add to that another layer when we say we also know we're going to have a tight pulse, maybe even a bit of a Wari pulse at times as well. But if we take those 4 without the Wari, if we just take those 4 qualities, it gives us a really good base pulse for Zhen Wu Tang, and that is deep, thin, faint, and tight. And that can be over all positions. I mean, we can look at positions more. It's likely to be a little bit deeper on the left Sun or the left Shu position, because that's a position for the heart and also a position for the kidney in the lower position. So we can look at different positions, but overall that deep, thin, faint, and tight as a good rule. And I think if we've got that and a few of those key symptoms, fatigue or somnolence for any Shaoyin condition, but also the inhibited urination, abdominal pain, potentially diarrhea, and that change in limbs, heaviness or cold of limbs, that's a really good start for having a solid diagnosis of Zhen Wu Tang.
And do you consider the patient's appearance as well when you're considering these things, or can you find those pulses in a variety of physical presentations for your patients, or you find it is there a demographic of types you find it in, or is that?
Well, I mean, Zhen Wu Tang we haven't really talked about the sort of pathology of the formula yet, but I mean, Zhen Wu Tang is a water problem. Okay, it's a cold water condition. So we do tend to see it's going to be more of it's usually we see Zhen Wu Tang as a Taiyin Shaoyin. It's Shaoyin chapter, but you can't get to Shaoyin without going through Taiyin. So Zhen Wu Tang's all about earth invading water. So we see a lot of water in the picture. We see a lot of damp pathology. So in terms of a body type, we're expecting to see that as well. We're not expecting to see a skinny, dry person. We're expecting to see a heavy, damp person. They've got this heaviness in the limbs, this coldness in the limbs. So lethargic, sluggish, pale complexion. We know that cold tends to make things paler, like the urine will be pale. It talks about that in line 282, I think, where it talks about the urine becomes pale because it's cold. The complexion becomes pale as well. I don't look at tongues, as I said, but I assume there'd be a pale tongue or something to go with it too.
And this thing about urination, I think it's a really difficult question to ask someone. How's the urination? Like, distinguishing inhibited urination, disinhibited urination. It's not an easy answer for people to give. I often hear, in clinic, you say, how's your urination? And people always answer, well, I drink enough water. That's not the question. That's not what you're trying to determine. So I was always asking practitioners, experienced practitioners, like, what is the question that you've asked? Do you have a question for that to determine whether they're inhibited or disinhibited?
Yeah, well, I mean, I still blame Clio magazine from back in the 80s for everyone drinking 8 glasses of water. It's like Clio syndrome. It was like, and people nowadays you say it, and I get millennials come in the clinic. Like, I had a student come in the clinic. I'm like, Clio syndrome. Like, what? Like,
I don't think anyone would know that anymore.
Isn't Clio a magazine anymore? I'm like, Clio syndrome. I must drink my 8 glasses of water a day. I'm like, no, drink enough water to pee 4 or 5 times. So I'm always looking for, do you urinate 4 or 5 times? But I struggled a lot, and in fact, I still do. I might have even done it today, so I apologise if I've said it all. When we use the term inhibited and uninhibited urination, just those 2 words, you'll go, with Zhen Wu Tang, there should be an uninhibited. No, there should be inhibited urination, but it may be uninhibited. So it gets really confusing, and we have this idea that inhibited urination must be urinary retention. It's not necessarily urinary retention. That can be really painful. People come in, I can't urinate, and I've got all this distension and pain there. Look, that can be inhibited urination, but inhibited urination might actually be frequent. Mm-hmm. And this is something that really stuck with me a few years ago. And this is from Steve Bonzak, who is also one of the ICAM instructors. And he said, and it's something I've been wrestling with for a long time. And I said, look, I was kind of like tentatively wanting to put my hand up and say in class, what if it's frequent? Because I always saw Zhen Wu Tang cases that had a lot of frequent urination because there's a lot of water there. Like, I know there's a cold contraction of the bladder, but they seem to be weeing all the time. And he just nailed it when he said, when your bladder's cold, it contracts. So you can't hold enough urine. So you either completely hold it when it closes over altogether, and that's why you can spike a fever with Zhen Wu Tang. Like, your bladder completely closes, there's no yin emptying back out, the yang floats up and away, you spike a fever. Or it's just, it can't hold a good volume of urine, so you're just urinating small amounts all the time. So usually when I'm actually trying to find out if they've got inhibited urination, I'm actually asking how many times a day they urinate, but I'm really focused on, are they urinating a small amount a lot, or are they only urinating very few times compared to the amount of fluid they're taking in? And so if they're not urinating at all with the amount of fluid they're taking in, that could be an inhibited urination. Or if they're just urinating clear lots of times a day and through the night as well, then I know, okay, that's a fair chance. That's inhibited urination as well. Interestingly, I've not often seen, it's probably one of the few modifications of the 4 standard modifications of Zhen Wu Tang. As I said, I don't often use the diarrhea modification, which is to take Xinjiang out, take B.Acu out, add Ganjiang in. I don't often use that. I go straight to a Dashuan Wu Tang, as I said. I use the cough modification all the time. I've occasionally used the retching modification, but I don't usually think of Zhen Wu Tang when I'm thinking of retching. But I've almost never used the uninhibited urination modification, which is fulling out, because I haven't seen a case of Zhen Wu Tang where it's truly, I think, uninhibited urination. Because every time I've seen it, it takes a bit of questioning and working on it, but it turns out, the few cases of like, oh, this person's urinating all the time. And then I had a guy that I thought, this is it, this is the one. And he went off when he arrived to the toilet, then came back. And then before he got on the table, he'd go to the toilet and come back. And it just clicked all of a sudden. I realized, he's gone for 30 seconds. Like, I run out the room and do something else because I run 2 rooms. I'm totally by myself at the clinic. I don't have reception or anything. So I use every bit of time. But I ran out and came back and thought, he's already back in the room. That's not a good volume of urine. That's small amounts frequent. And I just constantly see this small amount frequent. So I don't know if I've ever seen a truly uninhibited urination with Zhen Wu Tang, like totally bladder opening up, just flooding. So
it's a good gauge as well to see how well the formula is working. If you're tracking that, it's a good sort of checks and balance. Okay, yeah, great. When you first came to see me, you were doing, you were
yeah, well,
going to
particularly
the bathroom 20 times a day, and now you're going 10, and now you go on 5, and now you go on 3, and now now you go on the regular amount. Or as well, like you mentioned briefly, nocturia. That nighttime urine is very good indication because people actually don't remember how many times they went during the day, but they typically remember how many times they went during the night.
Always remember at night.
Always,
yeah.
right? And that sort of relates to dominance as well. So, yeah.
And I always want to differentiate that. Do you wake up because you need to wee, or do you wake up and go, oh, I'm up, might as well wee? And I'm like, if they're up and might as well wee, I just don't count it. I don't count it at all. People, oh yeah, I have to go during the night, but like, hang on, I'm awake, and then I like
in the first place, like that probably woke you as well.
Yeah.
So
and I'm like, if it woke them, then yes. But if they just woke up and they're just lying there, I'm sitting here for an hour trying to get back to sleep and I'm bored, I'll get up and wee just to try and, I do it myself. I'll go to the toilet to try and reset my body clock and get back to sleep. So I don't count that, but I really do look at the nocturia because it's really interesting to see. You give people full thing, and even when I dose up, that's one modification that I do use, and it's only a very slight modification, just playing with the dosage of an ingredient. In line 82, it talks about Zhen Wu Tang, as we said, for the shaking, tremors, and twitching, and all this sort of thing, which is very similar to the description of Lingui Jugan Tang. And that's why there's some, we say they're formula equivalencies in our system. Now, when I see those sort of patterns, that's when the water has gotten all the way up and it's actually harassing the chest. I'll often increase the Fuling and go to Fuling 12, which is Lingui Jugan Tang pulse, Lingui Jugan Tang dosage, or I'll even go all the way up to the Lingui Salzao Tang dosage of 24. And you give people 24 grams of Fuling and they stop weeing at night. And when that used to happen, I'd go, oh, okay, I want to say the system's broken, but it has to be me that's broken because that doesn't make sense. It's a diuretic. How are they going less? Because they're going properly during the day and they're emptying their bladder. And it's just beautiful when you see that. People go, hey, is there any diuretics in my formula? And you go, and it doesn't happen often, but people, because I wee all the time, I don't want to go, is there any diuretics in my formula? I'm like, I haven't put anything in this formula that's going to make you wee more at night. Don't worry about that at all. And then later on, we'll have the conversation where I say, look, technically you could describe this herb as a diuretic, but it's not the way, like, it's not a diuretic like taking furosemide or a medication of some kind as a diuretic. Like, it's just not the same thing. And it's really lovely when that happens. Like, I really love that.
And so, well, I'm interested to talk about the individual ingredients to some degree, but it's not really how the formula works, in any respect. Anything else that, like, you talk a lot about, your passion, and sort of related to this Taoist philosophy. Does that come into your framework of thinking when you're using this formula?
Yeah, well, it does. Particularly because I have a big focus on the what I teach and what I practice a lot of is the Wu Yun system, the 5 movements and 6 Qi. And as people listen to this podcast now who are like, wow, it took all that time for Tyler to get onto the 5 movements and 6 Qi. Yeah, because I bang on about it constantly. It's a big thing for me. It gets misrepresented a lot. This year in particular, COVID came in and people said, well, did the Yun Qi system predict it? Because they've got this idea that the Wu Yun Qi system is this linear framework of, it's a predictive system that helps you predict what's going to happen for the year. And it's a very limited view of what it does. The Yun Qi system is about, it's using the 6 conformations and understanding that throughout a year, the conformations will visit at their regular times, that's the seasons, and then we'll have what we call a visiting Qi, a Qi that's out of season. Something that's visiting when it shouldn't be visiting or visiting for too long. And each year you can sort of calculate what the visiting Qi will be. And the visiting Qi for this year is Xiao Yin. So Xiao Yin is the visiting Qi for this year, and there's also what we call the Yun, or the movement for the year, which is kind of like the general theme for the year, and that's just a 5-element thing. And the general theme for the year is excess metal this year. So we've got Xiaoyin visiting, and we've got excess metal this year. And so when I was putting together, looking at this year, not predicting COVID, I didn't predict COVID because I said I don't use that system as a predictive system. It's not divination. It's all about local observation. So I can only see what's going on here in my little neck of the woods. I can have a vague idea about what's going on elsewhere. When I was in Germany last year, I had to sort of say, hey, what's it been like lately? Has it been really cold or has it been really hot? And in the Yunqi system, it has all these little modifiers fit in, just like modifying a formula, that allow you to understand, okay, what's happening. It says, if spring arrives early, then it'll be like this. But if spring doesn't arrive early, it'll be like this. So it's not this limited linear, you just calculate and you get this calculation, therefore you use this formula. We'd never recommend practicing in that way. I'll just use this formula for everyone this year. It doesn't make sense. Not everyone can have the same pathology. But when I did the calculations for this year, I was like, okay, if it comes out the way it's expected, if we see particularly hot in the first half of the year, and then we've got underlying current of this, that, and the year, then the first formula that sprung to mind was, Zhen Wu Tang cough modification. Oh, that's a great formula. That's a Xiaoyin formula. And it's Xiaoyin year, like this year is Xiaoyin visiting. And then we have this underlying theme of metal. That's 5-element metal. So you're looking at lung. So you're thinking like lung conditions. I was like, Zhen Wu Tang cough mod. That'll be an important formula this year. And there's the one thing where I could confidently say, okay, I wish I had predicted COVID. I didn't. I did comment Chinese New Year last year. I said we might get an epidemic later in the year. We often do, because in the later half of last year, Xiaoyang was visiting. Said often when Xiaoyang visits during winter, it's a big disparity because you've got fire during winter, and that's a time you often get epidemics. But I was not expecting COVID. I forgot what I even said that. Someone turned around later and said, you said this, Tyler. I'm like, yeah, that's cool. That's not me predicting an epidemic. I'd love to give myself that pat on the back. I can't, but what I can pat myself on the back for, as I said, Zhen Wu Tang cough mod will be an important formula this year. And we are finding that in ICAM, that as a post-COVID formula, it's going to be a really important formula for those chronic long-term coughs. And it's probably the most common modification I use of Zhen Wu Tang is the cough modification, which for those who don't know it, it's add Wu Weizi, Xixin, and Ganzhang. Keep the Shenzhang in, add Ganzhang as well. And that's been really important this year. So when I looked at the Yunqi and saw that, I went, that's why I've got to talk about this formula this year. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm just walking around everyone going, Zhen Wu Tang cough mod, Zhen Wu Tang cough mod, Zhen Wu Tang cough mod, but it's on my mind. I'm making sure I've got all the ingredients in stock. If I'm tossing up between that and another formula, it's a real liner, which doesn't often happen, but maybe I'm looking at a case, I'm trying to decide, is it a Xiaoyang flare cough, or have they slipped back into Xiaoyin? What's going on here? Then I'm going to go, hey, you know what? There's a fair chance it's going to be Zhen Wu Tang. And you know what? It's working, and I'm sure other people are finding the same. They're putting out a lot of Zhen Wu Tang, particularly for the post-COVID treatment or just post-viral treatment with those lingering coughs that just won't go away once they've slipped past the Yang conformations into the Yin conformations.
So, do you want to talk about anything else? We're going to talk about. You want to talk about?
We can talk about the ingredients, and we haven't really talked about the sort of kind of the physiology of Zhen Wu Tang, what's sort of going on with the formula, which I think is important. Like, I mean, you can use it without understanding how it works. You can just know the pulse, know the symptoms, take the pulse, do this. But it's kind of nice to have some grounding in the physiology behind it and the herbs as well. And look, I spend a lot of time on the Shenan Bensao Jing, the original Materia Medica, the Shennong's Materia Medica, and the Tangye Jing. I love old texts, so I love looking at how they look at the herbs. So when I look at individual herbs, like I'm not looking at, Fuling is I don't know, what is it in the Bensky Jing, like a drain dampness herb or something. I look at Fuling and go straight away, hey, what does it say in the Tangye Jing? Well, in the Tangye Jing, Fuling is the water herb of Fuling is sweet or sweet. It's sweet. In the Shenan Bensao Jing, it's neutral, but nowadays we call it neutral. But in the Shenan Bensao Jing, it's sweet because they don't talk about the flavor of neutral. The flavor of bland. I've just messed up my terminology. It's bland. It's often called nowadays, but in Shenan Bensao Jing, that was just referred to as sweet. In terms of its qi, it's neutral. Sorry, it's sweet neutral or bland neutral. So because it's sweet, it's an earth herb. So in the Tang Jing, we have this section where it talks about each of the herbs. It gives 5 examples for the 5 elements. And each element you have, for the earth element, you have the earth herb of the earth class, the fire herb of the earth class, the water herb of the earth class, the metal herb of the earth class, and the wood herb of the earth class. And this sort of gives you a little understanding of each herb. And anyone in ICM knows this. It's some of the base stuff we teach. But for people who haven't come across it before, it's a really interesting way to look at the herbs. So if you look at something like Fuling, it's sweet neutral. It's sweet, so therefore it's earth class. And it has an effect on water. So we refer to it as the water herb of the earth class. It strengthens Earth's control over water. So what it actually does is it sort of helps push the mandate of Earth onto water. Okay, it kind of forces Earth's control over water. So I always think of it's kind of there like pushing the water away. And then you get B.Acu. B.Acu is kind of works synergistically with Fuling in Zhen Wu Tang, or in many forms, but in Zhen Wu Tang, it is quite a common, even in TCM, a common combination. And that is B.Acu is bitter. So bitter herbs belong to the water class, and it's the earth herb of the water class. So you've got Fuling as the water herb of the earth class, and you've got B.Acu as the earth herb of the water class. They're kind of opposites. And for every time that Fuling is kind of pushing water away, I always think of B.Acu. B.Acu's Conor McGregor. B.Acu's there, sitting there, like going, "Come on." B.Acu's calling it out. So B.Acu pulls the water out, sits there going, "Come on, come and get me." So Fuling's pushing it out. B.Acu's pulling the water out. So they kind of work together there really nicely. We've got Fulze, obviously, or Pal Fulze, so baked Fulze, which is pungent. So all pungent herbs in the Tang Jing belong to the wood class. So of the wood class, it is the water herb of the wood class. It's the water herb of the wood class because its action is on the water layer, and we often say like it fans fire. It strengthens wood to fan fire, to generate more fire. And I think it's really interesting that we often talk about, I'll get to that when I talk about the physiology of the formula, how foods are actually, what it actually works on in the body. Because we often think of it as a warming herb or a kidney tonic, like it warms the kidneys or it strengthens the kidneys. But I think there's kind of another step in between, but I'll get to that in a minute. We'll do the rest of the ingredients. Because we've got B.Ch. B.Ch in the Tang Jing is sour, okay? It's bitter in the Shenong Bensao Jing, but in the Tang Jing it's sour. So being sour, we put it in the metal, as a metal class. And in the metal class, it is the wood herb of the metal class. Being the wood herb, what that means is it helps metal control wood. When metal's controlling wood, it backs wood off earth. So it's actually doing it to indirectly help strengthen earth. The same thing Fuling's doing. Fuling's strengthening earth to push that water out. B.Acu's pulling that water out. And then we've got B.Ch is actually taking some of the pressure off earth by controlling wood, by putting that control on wood. Last ingredient we've got is Xinjiang. In the Shenong Bensao Jing, there's no differentiation between Xinjiang and Ganjiang, but we know it's pungent. Okay? It's definitely pungent for either of them. We talk about it as the earth herb of the wood class, and that is it. Being the earth herb of the wood class, it's a water layer herb, and it warms the young within the earth to help push the damp out. So in Suwen chapter 22, it talks about using pungent flavors to disperse fluids. So as a dispersing quality to move fluids out, and that's how we're using Xinjiang in this case. And if we put all that together, it gives us a kind of an idea of how the physiology of Zhen Wu Tang works. And if I can ask people to allow me the grace of using a trigram. I love all my trigrams and things, and I know sometimes people go, "Oh God, trigrams and stems and branches and crap. It's not medicine." Trigrams aren't medicine. They can help you understand things about Chinese medicine, and they can be really useful. And I think there's a particular hexagram that really clearly describes Zhen Wu Tang for me. And this is something that I really love to look at because I know the grandfather of our lineage, Dr. Tian, used to use hexagrams to describe the formulas. Now, I don't know at all if this is the hexagram he used to describe Zhen Wu Tang. We don't have a lot of that in his. There's some things in his notes, but we don't. A lot of that information's lost. But I'd like to think he uses this hexagram to describe Zhen Wu Tang. So I'll paint, if we can take a moment, I'll paint a little picture to let's explain the pathology of Zhen Wu Tang. So first thing, we need 2 trigrams to make up a hexagram. Trigram is 3 lines, hexagram is 6 lines. For the water element, we can use the trigram Kan. So Kan is the water trigram in the I Ching, the classic of change, or in Australian, as we love to call it, the I Ching. It is in the chapter called the Shou Gua Zhuan, which is the discussion of the trigrams. Okay, Kan is the water trigram. It's the direction north. It connects to the ears. It's sinking. It's labor. Okay, it's labor. So that you labor in Kan. So we link this to the kidneys. It has that connection to the ears. It's obviously talking about the kidneys. Suwen chapter 8, the kidneys, the working strong official. Okay, laboring, working strong. So we use the water trigram to represent water. Makes a whole lot of sense. To represent the kidney, to represent water, the part of the pathology. And the water trigram, if you can just picture this, trigrams have these broken lines and solid lines. It's easy to remember because solid lines are phallic and broken lines are gynocentric. For anyone who's not sure what gynocentric is, it looks like a vagina, and phallic is obviously what it sounds like. So we've got a broken line, a solid line, a broken line. This is the water trigram. So broken on either side, a yin line either side, with a solid line through the middle. And the way we remember this is, if you think of water, it's permeable, it's yielding. Yin lines are yielding. Like when you go, oh, water, it's like I can push right through it. But in the middle, there's strength, like there's force, there's hardness. Okay, so we have 2 yin lines on the outside, a yang line in the middle, and that yang line is really important. And the trigram we're going to stack above this, as we said before, the pathology or the physiology of a Zhen Wu Tang is Tai Yin, Shao Yin. You have to move through Tai Yin before you get to Shao Yin. So we've got some earth pathology in with water pathology. We talked about that before, like the strength of like earth invading water and strengthening earth to deal with the water. So the trigram we use for the earth element is the earth trigram, Kun. Now the Kun trigram is 3 broken lines. Okay, 3 broken lines, and it's the most yin trigram. Now you'd sort of think, wouldn't the most yin trigram be water because it's the most yin element? Suwen chapter 4. There's a line that talks about the yin within yin is the yin within yin is the most yin, is the Zhi yin, the ultimate yin, and it's talking about the spleen. So the spleen is often referred to as the Zhi yin, the ultimate yin. So I'm going to use the earth trigram to represent the spleen. Kun represents the spleen. So if we picture all this together now, it's an easy one because there's not a whole lot going on. Basically, you've got all these broken lines with one little solid line. Second from the bottom, there's a solid line. So you've got 3 broken lines on top, the top trigram, and the next trigram down, you've got broken line, solid line, broken line. That solid line, that's Zhen Wu Tang. That's what it's doing. That's the most important part, because what you've got is you've just got massive amounts of water in the body, okay? The dampness of Tai Yin is invading the water of the kidneys. So we've got a huge water pathology going on. How do we fix that? We need to put a bit of yang in there. And we put that bit of yang in there. That's the Xuan Wu, the dark warrior. The dark warrior within Xuan Wu Tang is Fuzi. Each of the 4 spirit decoctions are based on one herb. The red bird is egg yolk. The white tiger is shugao. The green dragon is ma huang. And the dark warrior, the black warrior, is Fuzi. Okay, so that is that solid line at the second from the bottom of the trigram. Not right on the bottom, second from the bottom. And when we put Fuzi in there, like we're putting it in under massive layers of water, okay? You've got the earth trigram on top, it's all yin lines, and within the middle of water. And what we're trying to do is use that Fuzi to kind of steam up and through. Because what we've got is a situation where there's the yang is depleted, the yang is floating up and away. And where there's no yang, we get yin invading, we get cold, we get heaviness. That's why we get these heavy aches. That's why we get this periumbilical pain. That's a cold contraction. We don't have a lot of fire. And when we don't have a lot of fire, the earth becomes weak. So we put that fire in down the bottom. Now that fire we put in down the bottom, we say we're warming the kidneys. If you look at the Tang Jing, it says that this is insufficiency of the kidneys and cold of the kidneys. So it makes sense to think, well, then the dark warrior, Xuanwu, Fuzi, must be warming the kidneys. Yes, but the kidneys are a water element. So how do we generate fire in the middle of water? Well, that trigram we just talked about, that water trigram, we've got two broken lines with a solid line in the middle. I want you to now visualize that trigram turning 90 degrees on its side. And if we turn it on its side, we've now got a broken line either side with a vertical solid line through the middle. If it makes it even easier, the phallic symbol in the middle is now erect. And there is a gynocentric or a yonic symbol either side. Now, those two broken lines, if you can, and I don't place a lot of value in imagery unless it has a really good clinical application. So I don't like going into some crazy thing where we're going to start to pull in Western astrology and all sorts of other stuff. I'm like, yeah, that's not medicine. That's not even Chinese medicine. But just for this one, I think it's really nice when you look at the symbol of it. If we've got two yin lines either side, in our lower abdomen, what two yin organs do we have? The kidneys. Okay, the two yin lines of the kidneys, and in the middle there's a yang line. What is the yang that's in between the two kidneys? Oh, it's the Mingmen. That's the Mingmen, the life gate fire. And that's Taoist terminology. That got added into Chinese medicine later on. That's not in the that's not in the that's not in the Shanghan. That's not in the Neijing. Not in that context anyway. But yeah, you can use the term Mingmen. But okay, so where's the fire from Mingmen coming through? What's the fire in the lower abdomen? There's only one rep of fire in the lower abdomen, and the lower abdomen rep of fire is the small intestine. And this is where I think where Fuzi is really important. Fuzi helps warm the small intestine. It's that heat source between the two kidneys. It's that vertical line, if we turn the trigram on its side, of yang right in the middle. And if you imagine that like Arno Veslous uses the term a nuclear fuel rod, okay? I think of it like the element in a kettle. You put that hot element in there and it starts to warm outwards. And that's what keeps that balance there. It's the heat of the small intestine that warms the kidneys. It's the cold of the kidneys that keeps the small intestine cool. They balance together. But in this situation, it's completely swamped in Zhen Wu Tang. Okay, the fire of the small intestine is being put out. It's floating up and away. So we put Fuzi in there to really warm that fire and then generate all that heat to warm the kidneys. And that's what actually warms the water element, is indirectly through the small intestine. Fuzi is a water layer herb. We know it goes to the water layer, so it warms the water layer of the small intestine. But the small intestine, one of the most highly vasculated, I've got a cat just jumped in my lap. One of the most highly vasculated, he's a black cat, he's my dark warrior. One of the most highly vasculated organs in the body. A huge amount of blood flowing through the small intestine. So it's a great representative of the fire element in the lower jiao. And that's kind of how I look at the pathology of Zhen Wu Tang from this trigram. And that his hexagram. That hexagram is actually the seventh hexagram for anyone who wants to look it up. It's called the army. And what I love is when you read about the army as a hexagram, it talks about conflict or obstruction due to great water, and that perseverance, the strong man, he assembles, he disciplines the masses. And I think that perseverance, that strong man, that's Fuzi going into the middle and steaming those fluids up and out from the center and generating that warmth through the system.
Yeah, who would think that all these things would be connected in some way? That's just...
I think it's really cool. I mean,
anyone who's listening, and I encourage them to draw it, because as Tyler was describing that, I drew that trigram, drew that hexagram, and you know what occurred to me when I was drawing it is that it looks exactly the same as the pulse that you talked about before. Like
cool.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, look at the left side, right side. Like, it's exactly what you're saying in the pulse.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Who knows? Who knows? Who would have thought all these things would have been absolutely connected? That's just awesome. Good stuff.
Yeah, that's what we're just trying to just grab that tiny little bit of yang left there and just warm it up and steam it right up through the system.
Perfect. What a great explanation, man. Absolutely beautiful.
The steaming up through the small intestine. That was going to be my segue to go into mentioning some combinations, because I had a little thing that came up on that made a lot of sense to some of the combos that it's used for, some of the conditions it's used for. So,
okay, so what were you saying about the combinations? And you mentioned earlier you were going to mention some combinations and formula modifications that you were...
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, keeping in mind that idea of the physiology of Zhen Wu Tang as as the way we see it in ICM, that it's warming the small intestine. Look, we're warming the kidneys, but we're doing it through the small intestine. And this isn't something that I came up with myself. This is from Arno Versluis. He did a lot of research on this and did a fantastic lecture on it a few years back. And in fact, I was talking about it with a TCM colleague a while back. And was talking about it. I said, oh yeah, I said he was at Rothenberg. He did a whole day on the small intestine, and she went, oh wow, that's great. So did you talk about SIBO? And I just kind of laughed because I was like, your SIBO, whatever, small intestine bacterial overload. And I was like, that doesn't even exist in our world. Like that's not a Chinese medicine condition. Not to say we can't treat it. But I said, and I was trying to explain to her, I said, that's not Chinese medicine. You can't say this is a formula for SIBO or SIBO is this condition. Like, I said, but that's not the way we think in Chinese medicine. But I realized the more I was talking to her, I was like, I'm going to have to admit in the end, but yeah, you know what? Zhen Wu Tang's a great formula for food intolerances. I use it for food intolerances all the time. And I was like, well, it's kind of cool because I sort of had a moment where I said, you know what? It's one of the few times where I see a little bit of a crossover. I used to always say the small intestine was, and this was something from one of my teachers, was amongst the long-term unemployed in Chinese medicine because there were so few conditions that related to small intestine when you study TCM. And I was like, well, it doesn't really get used. And then with our understanding now, which I've starting with Arno Versluis and Laurie Ayres and Steve Bonzak, in ICEM, we have a much better understanding of how the small intestine works. And it's really nice occasionally to get a crossover and go, hey, this is an actual small intestine pathology from a Western medical point of view, SIBO, which is responsible for a lot of food intolerances, that responds beautifully to Zhen Wu Tang, completely unmodified. I use it all the time for food intolerances. Obviously, when I'm seeing those presentations, the abdominal pain around the umbilicus, as I said, that's the Fukushima region where they diagnosed Zhen Wu Tang. But I also, as I said, abdominal pains. I also use it a lot for hot flushes, unmodified, which was one of those things which for anyone in ICM, they're like, yeah, of course, like the young's floating up and away, you get a hot flush. But that was one of those moments that utterly blew my mind when I went, I can't give someone with hot flushes Fulzer. They're going to be worse. I can't give them a hot formula until you start to appreciate. And it was beautiful when I had, it was two things that had happened. One, in the past, I had a person come in who said, I've got terrible hot flushes. And it was so bad, she was asking me to pick up my little fan and run the fan on her to cool her down. And then she went, no, cold. And I was like, yeah, no, it is on cold. She said, no, I'm cold now. Turn it on hot. And I was just turning it hot, cold. And I was like, hang on a minute. So when you're not hot, you're freezing cold? And I was early in practice, and I was tearing my hair out, as anyone who knows me saw what happened. And I just didn't know what to do. And I was like, how can you have hot and cold? And that's when I was first introduced to the formula B.Chm, which has hot herbs and cold herbs. And I went, oh, this is fantastic. You can treat kidney hot and kidney cold at the same time. And it was later on that I started to realize that there really isn't a lot of hot flushes and heat without cold somewhere else. And if all the heat's in the upper part of the body, somewhere else is cold. And I really loved one of my long-term clients when she came in, and I said, I'd had her on Zhen Wu Tang for a little while. She can't come in often because she's a few hours away. And send her off, she came back. I said, how are you feeling? She said, warm. And I said, damn it. She said, down here, and just rubbed her belly. And she said, it's so nice to feel warm in my belly. I didn't realize how long it had felt cold for. How's the hot flushes? My belly feels warm. There was just no discussion of hot flushes. And I was like, nailed it.
There you go. Yeah.
Other than that, there's a few combinations I use. I consider Fulzer Tang. There's the inline modifications. As I said, I think we talked about those already. I use a lot of the cough mod. That's fantastic. I sometimes combine with Lingui Jugan Tang. There's a lot of crossover. They have a lot of similar symptomology, and I'll use that with a lot of chronic sinus or cough cases. But also if we're getting those symptoms of the upward rushing. What I love about when you understand the physiology in Zhen Wu Tang, you can see how it can affect all three jowls. It can affect the lower jowl where we get this, where we get the contraction of the bladder. It can affect into the middle jowl where we start to get potentially vomiting or nausea or diarrhea. We've got damp invading the earth. And if that fluid, if that rebels upward high enough, we get it right up into the chest, and you get all those chest symptoms, palpitation, fluttering, twitching and shaking and tremors. And that's often when I'll use the Lingui Jugan Tang or just up the Fuling, which works really nicely as well. As I said, I tend to use Zhen Wu Tang plus Li Zhongwan, which is basically Da Xuan Wu Tang for chronic diarrhea cases. I like to think of it as Zhen Wu Tang plus Li Zhongwan. In ICAM, we often describe it as Fu Zi Tang plus Sini Tang as a way to describe it, but it comes to the same formula. I think of it as Zhen Wu Tang plus Li Zhongwan because I remember Da Xuan Wu Tang always has a Xiao Xuan Wu Tang base, as in Zhen Wu Tang. So I kind of added in that way. But I also like to think of Fu Zi Tang as a modification of Zhen Wu Tang. Now, it is a separate formula on its own, but it is the same ingredients. We just drop the Qingzhang out. We double the Fu Zi and the B.Acu, and we add Renchen. And it's a fantastic formula for chronic obstructive pain condition, joints, arthritic conditions. Works beautifully. And I still see that as just, I'm using Zhen Wu Tang. It's just a modified Zhen Wu Tang. That's right, I was saying chronic diarrhea. But don't get stuck on thinking of Zhen Wu Tang as only diarrhea because it works great for constipation as well. In that case, we usually combine it with Zhishu Shaoyasan, which is just Zhishu and Baishao. The Baishao is already in there, so we just drop in Zhishu to equal the Baishao, and that works great for constipation, just adding in that 9 grams of Zhishu. Or sometimes I'll pop in Shebai, which works quite well because we all need farts. They make the world a funnier place, and they help move your bowels through as well. And Shebai is great for bringing in the farts. So I think we need more farts right now in the world.
It makes it after that, doesn't it? Like you notice it happens for a little bit, and then they start to regulate beautifully.
And then hey, it's giving me gas. No.
Puts it in the intestines and gets rid of it. It's amazing. Yeah.
It's like no, you've got the gas. It's not giving you the gas. We're just getting the gas out. It's great.
Yeah.
I wrote down a couple of the combinations I use so I wouldn't forget. I think that's there is probably one or two others. Something which we have has gotten really popular a few years back. We did an advanced seminar in New Orleans with Arnaud Veslus, and we were looking at some of Dr. Tian's cases, and he loved combining Muli into Zhen Wu Tang, which I like the idea of. Muli's nicely explained by that same water trigram. It's sort of it's salty. It's sort of it brings water up to fire. Okay, it sort of brings the water up. So we use it when there's Zhen Wu Tang pattern with difficulty getting to sleep. They might still be desiring sleep during the day. They might still be somnolent, but they're having trouble sleeping. It works great with adding the Muli, or high blood pressure is really nice as well. Out of that, 2 combinations which were kind of go-tos for me for a long time, probably 2 of the first formulas where I combined complete formulas was Zhen Wu Tang with Xiao Jianzhong Tang, which was my go-to for a lot of chronic fatigue conditions. I don't use it as much nowadays. It's sort of led me to other paths, but I think it is a good starting point for a lot of people to play around with. And the other one, which is still my go-to, I don't do as much fertility work nowadays, which is good at the moment because I've been restricted to only essential care in Victoria. But when I do fertility work, I really love combining Zhen Wu Tang with Dangui Xiaoyasan. Is one of my favorite gynae combinations. Not just fertility, I mean a whole lot of other things, but that's where we've got. I kind of think of that as, it's Dangui Xiaoyasan is Jingui. It's complex disease chapter, but if we think of it as Dui Yin, we're kind of looking at Zhen Wu Tang plus Dangui Xiaoyasan. I kind of think of it as like my triple yin. You've got Zhen Wu Tang as Tai Yin Xiao Yin, and then you've got Dangui Xiaoyasan as Dui Yin when we've got a triple yin pathology. So it works well in a lot of different gynae cases, particularly where we've got a lot of fatigue in the pattern as well, or signs of blood dryness and deficiency. Yeah.
Tyler, it's always a pleasure chatting with you, mate. And just like hearing the level of, the way that you can see the world is a completely different way than most people nowadays see it. So it's just such a pleasure listening to you speak. So what's happening with you now? I mean, I know you're in lockdown, and what's happening in the future? What's the next thing? Or your teaching schedule, or I know you're in clinic all the time.
Yeah, well,
you want to get back to patients, but yeah,
we were trying to get me back to New Orleans because I was supposed to teach there in April, which I was very excited about. I mean, that's a bucket list thing to go teach an advanced seminar in the US. I think was a great thing. I really enjoyed doing it in Europe. That was great. I was really looking forward to New Orleans. So we tried to bump that to November this year, but our ultra-conservative government here just said no. We gave a really great letter explaining why. I did think it was kind of funny. Why should the guy in Australia be going to talk to the US about we were trying to angle that, hey, this is kind of a bit COVID related. And I thought, well, why would I be going to talk to them about COVID? They got way more cases. And I thought, well, maybe that's what they need. Like, maybe we need some Australians over there talking about COVID because we've got way less cases here. But it didn't fly. We didn't get accepted. So we've bumped that to April next year. So hopefully I'll be teaching there in April. And then we're going to run the same course in Australia. It was originally planned for late next year. We might bump that out further because we've had to move a few other things around. It's kind of the year that disappeared with COVID. So I'll be teaching that in Australia at some stage, and then I'll be continuing on doing some of the core teaching for ICAM as well. Teaching some of our diplomat subjects. We've got a whole range of subjects we teach there, and we're looking at kickstarting a new series of classes there when we can sort of get out of restrictions. I can't get 5Ks out of my home at the moment, so there's not much chance of me flying interstate, let alone even getting into Melbourne to teach. But hopefully there'll be some more ICM courses here in Australia in the future. And
hopefully this podcast will last a lot longer than a couple of months
yes, well,
in the future.
I'm hoping people are listening to this later and going, oh yeah, COVID, I forgot about all that. Yeah. Oh, you're in lockdown. Geez, they're still going on about that.
Oh wow, this is great. I might actually be able to go and see Tyler and just take a trip down to Mornington and check you out. Seaford, I mean.
I'm on the Mornington Peninsula, which is a great place to be at the moment. In my 5K range, I've got a distillery, a brewery, the beach, a number of parks, and my favourite organic shop, and my clinic. So it's not bad down here. I'm just enjoying a bit more time with family, doing a lot more study, and making a lot of plans for teaching, and a lot of plans in the clinic, and working on a few projects. So
awesome. Thanks so much.
Forward to what's coming up.
And
thanks so much for having me, Simon. It's always a pleasure to speak to you, and thanks for having me on your podcast. It's a real honour to be chosen to be on the podcast and to get to speak about such a fantastic.
Well deserved, my friend. Well deserved. So we'll put some details for your clinic and email address, and people can hound you and hound you now that you've got a bit of time.
Yep.
For years to come. So hopefully people can hound you with all sorts of questions. I know you're always keen to chat anything Chinese medicine. So
yep, I love Chinese medicine. I love talking, and always happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Tyler.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Bye-bye.